In the county of North Riding, Henry Thornton was known as a man of few, unnecessary words. This was said admiringly by some, the kind of admiration one extends to someone whose qualities would make life difficult if one were in close proximity to them, and without admiration by others, who had been on the receiving end of his particular brand of silence. Henry Thornton did not speak to fill rooms. He did not write to fill time. When he chose to say something, it had been considered at length, and when he chose not to say something, that too was considered. His neighbors had learned, over many years, to read both. The letter from the Duke of Wexford arrived on a Tuesday in November. Henry read it at his desk in the small study that looked over the frozen north field. He read it carefully, once, then again, which was his habit with things that warranted thought. He set it on the desk. He sat for a while. Then he went to find his daughter, who was in the kitchen garden, doing something efficient with the last of the autumn vegetables. And he told her the post had arrived and handed her the other letters that had come with it, and went back inside. He did not mention the Duke's letter. Clara Thornton received her letters, which were two, one from a cousin in York, one from a friend in Harrogate, and looked at her father's back as he walked away from her across the frost-white garden, and understood something. She had been understanding her father for 26 years, and she was good at it. She went inside and made sure she was not in the study when he returned to it. She did not ask. 6 weeks passed. During those 6 weeks, the letter sat on Henry Thornton's desk and was not replied to. It was not lost, not damaged, not forgotten. Henry was not a forgetful man. He went about his usual business, managing the Thornton farm, which was modest in size and immaculate in execution, attending the county meetings he had attended for 30 years, drinking his morning tea at exactly the same hour each morning, and his evening tea at exactly the same hour each evening. He was, to all appearances, precisely the same man he had been before November, but he had not replied to the letter. In December, the county began to talk. What does it mean to wait for someone who doesn't know they're being waited for? And does the test become unfair the longer it runs? Clara Thornton had met the Duke of Wexford in September at the Pemberton Harvest Gathering. She had not meant to meet him in any particular sense. She had gone to the gathering because the Pembertons invited the whole county every September, and because not going was more conspicuous than going, and she had gone with the intention of speaking to the people she actually wanted to speak to. Old James Whitmore about the shared drainage easement, and Anne Fenton about a book Anne had promised to lend her 3 months ago and appeared to have misplaced. She had not intended to stand near the east window at precisely the point when the Duke of Wexford turned away from a conversation that had clearly bored him and found himself facing the only other person in the room who was looking at something outside the room. "You're watching the dogs," he said. "I'm watching the one on the left," Clara said. "He's found something. The others don't know yet." The Duke looked. The dog on the left, a large brown animal of uncertain ancestry, had its nose pressed to a spot in the grass near the garden wall with the concentration of someone who has discovered something very important. The other 3 dogs were still ambling about. "What's your estimate?" he said. "Rabbit warren, I think. There were signs of it in that corner 2 weeks ago." She looked at him briefly. "Clara Thornton. Tobias Wexford." The dog on the left gave a short, sharp sound. The other 3 dogs converged immediately. They all watched this. "You were right," he said. "I usually am about that corner of their garden," she said. "I've been watching it for years." He looked at her then in the way he occasionally looked at things, fully, without the social performance of looking, which is what most people do at gatherings like this. She was aware of the look, didn't particularly react to it, and went back to watching the dogs arrange themselves around the Warren entrance. "Do you know the Pembertons well?" he asked. "Well enough. James Whitmore is who I actually came to see. He's somewhere near the cider." "Is the drainage easement urgent?" She looked at him. "I mentioned it to someone near the cider 3 minutes ago," he said. "I was passing. It sounded like a drainage easement situation." "It is. The autumn floods have complicated the shared culvert." "The west culvert?" "The west one, yes." She turned slightly to face him. "Do you know Whitmore?" "His father and mine." He glanced toward the cider table. "The west culvert has a particular silting problem. Your father will want to address it before March, or the spring melt will make it worse." Clara looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was its quieter cousin. "How do you know the west culvert?" "I rode that boundary last spring," he said, "when the easement question first came up in the county records." A small pause. "I read the records." "Did you?" "I find them useful." This was, she thought later, the moment. Not that she would have called it a moment at the time. She would have called it a conversation at a harvest gathering, which was a different thing. But it was the conversation after which she thought about the county records, and about the West Culvert, and about the man who had looked at the dogs without pretending not to see them, for the rest of the day, and intermittently for several weeks after. What is the difference between meeting someone and noticing someone? And is there ever a moment when one becomes the other? The weeks after the letter were, in the Thornton house, unremarkable. This was by design. Henry Thornton did not manufacture drama. When things were difficult, he was quieter than usual, which Clara understood to mean that he was thinking. And when things were resolved, he was exactly as quiet as usual, which meant he had reached a conclusion and it was settled. The shift between these two kinds of quiet was invisible to anyone who did not know him well. Clara knew him well. She watched him through November and into December. He continued to manage the farm. He continued his quarterly meeting duties. He ate his meals at the usual hours, and went to bed at the usual hour and rose at the usual hour, and was in all external respects Henry Thornton of Thornton Farm, North Riding, as he had been for the last 30 years. He had not replied to the letter. Clara had not read the letter. She did not know exactly what it said, though she had a good general understanding, because she knew enough about the situation, and about the Duke, and about the kind of letter a man writes in that situation to a woman's father, and also because her father's behavior since receiving it was a form of information in itself. In December, the county began to talk. The primary instrument of the county's talking was Sir Oswald Pemberton, not the older Pemberton who had given the harvest gathering, who was a generally agreeable man, but his younger brother, who occupied one of the smaller Pemberton properties 2 miles east, and who had a particular talent for interpreting other people's business in ways that served his own interpretation of events. Clara heard about it first from Anne Fenton, who had finally located the promised book and brought it in person, along with the information, offered with genuine sympathy rather than relish, that Oswald Pemberton had been saying at the Whitmore dinner that Henry Thornton had given the Duke a very clear answer, and the matter was entirely closed. "He said no?" Clara said. "Oswald says he said no." Anne set the book down, or gave an indication which amounted to no. "He was very certain about it." Clara looked at the book without seeing it. "My father has not said no," she said. "I didn't think he had." Anne paused. "But you know how it becomes?" Clara knew how it became. She had been living in a county long enough to understand that what Oswald Pemberton said at the Whitmore dinner on a Thursday became, by the following Tuesday, the generally accepted account of a situation. Not because Oswald was lying, particularly. He might have genuinely believed his version, but because he was the first person to put a version forward, and first versions have a particular staying power. What she did not understand was why. Why Oswald Pemberton would care whether the Duke of Wexford had been refused or not. What advantage it was to him to have that story circulating. There were explanations. His oldest son had recently become marriageable, for one, which meant the question of who was or wasn't available was more than idle interest, but nothing certain. She did not tell her father about any of this. When does a rumor become something more serious than a rumor, and who decides the difference? The farm in December was a particular kind of work. Most people think of winter as the season when a farm rests, and in one sense this is true. The fields are empty, the pace is different, there is no urgency of harvest or planting. In another sense, it is the season of assessment and planning, the quiet work that determines what the spring will look like. Clara had learned this from her father, who had learned it from his, and she approached December the way she approached all systematic work, methodically, without complaint, paying attention to the things that could be known and not spending time on the things that couldn't. She checked the drainage culverts. She reviewed the winter feed stores. She prepared the quarterly accounts with the care that comes from knowing exactly how much margin there is and how little tolerance for error. Henry Thornton's farm was not large, but it was precisely managed. Every yield recorded, every expenditure explained, every arrangement with neighboring farms documented in the ledger her father kept, with the consistency of someone who has decided that good records are not an administrative task, but a moral one. Clara had inherited this view. She also maintained her own supplementary ledger, which her father knew about and periodically consulted, in which she recorded things that were not in the main ledger: observations about soil patterns, notes on which of their decisions had produced what results, questions she had not yet answered. This was how she thought best, on paper, in order, with space for what she didn't know yet. The Duke had asked her about drainage. She had answered about drainage. This exchange had been followed by a conversation that moved through several other topics: the county record system, the way seasonal flooding behaved differently on east-facing fields, whether the new road proposal through Whitmore land would solve or create problems, and what she had discovered in the course of that conversation was something she had not expected to discover at a harvest gathering: that the person she was talking to was actually following her and adding to what she said, and not performing the act of following while thinking about something else. This was rarer than it should be. She wrote, that evening in September, a brief note to herself in the supplementary ledger. Spoke to the Duke of Wexford about the West Culvert and related matters for approximately 90 minutes. He has read the county drainage records, which no one does. He caught an error I hadn't noticed in my September notes on the silting pattern. He was correct. She did not write anything further about him for several months. She did not need to. The ledger was for things she was still working out. What is the difference between being listened to and being heard? And is the difference obvious in the moment or only afterward? Sir Oswald Pemberton came to call in the second week of December. This was not unprecedented. The Pembertons and the Thorntons were neighboring families in the particular sense of neighbors who share boundaries rather than affection, and social calls between them happened at the predictable intervals that county life requires, regardless of what anyone actually feels about the matter. Sir Oswald himself was a man of perhaps 50, with the confident manner of someone who has spent his whole life in a position that is almost, but not quite, as significant as he believes it to be. He was not without intelligence. He was without the habit of applying it to the question of whether other people wished him to know their business. He sat in the front parlor and accepted tea and spoke for approximately 20 minutes on topics that had nothing in particular to do with why he had come. Then he arrived at it in the way of a man who has been circling and is now ready to land. It must be a complicated situation, he said, with some sympathy, the kind that has been prepared in advance. Which situation is that? Clara said. The Wexford business. He set down his tea. I hope you know, all of us in the county understand really, that these things are not always, that a gentleman of that position has various pressures and considerations, and that when a family, he gestured vaguely, makes a particular decision, that it is of course entirely their own. My father has made no decision that I'm aware of, Clara said. Sir Oswald paused. I had heard, he said, that there was a reply, that the matter was— You heard incorrectly, Clara said. Will you have more tea? She offered it with complete composure, and he accepted it with the expression of a man whose visit has not gone entirely as planned, but who is not yet prepared to abandon the position entirely. Charles has been asking after you, he said after a moment. His son, 23, recently returned from some time in Bath. How nice for him, Clara said. She held the composure until he left. Then she sat alone for a few minutes in the parlor where the fire was burning down and thought about the particular patience required to smile at someone who is attempting to use your own business against you while wearing the face of a friend. Her father came through presently, noticed her expression, and sat down in the opposite chair. Pemberton, he said, not a question. Sir Oswald, his son Charles is asking after me. Henry Thornton looked at the fire. Is he? He said. He mentioned it. Another pause. He's also been telling people you've refused, Clara said. Told the Whitmore dinner, apparently, that you gave a clear answer. She paused. You haven't given any answer. Henry regarded the fire for a moment more. No, he said. I thought not. He got up and went to the study. Clara heard the usual sounds of the study being settled into for the evening, the chair, the lamp, the small sound of a book taken from a shelf. She sat with the fire and thought about the difference between someone who says what they think and someone who does what they mean. Is there a person in your life whose silence is more informative than other people's speeches? And what does it cost to trust that silence? Margaret Dunmore came in January. She arrived on a Thursday when the cold had settled in properly, and the road from her house was passable but not pleasant. And she came ostensibly because she had a question about the shared sheepfold arrangement that ran along the eastern boundary of both their properties. Clara suspected there was more to the visit than the sheepfold, because Margaret Dunmore had been navigating county arrangements for 40 years and had never needed to consult about a sheepfold question in January, when the same question could equally well have been sent by letter. Margaret was 63, widowed, and conducted herself with the particular authority of a woman who has outlived any need to present herself as other than what she is. She had known Henry Thornton before Clara was born, had known Clara's mother too, which was a different kind of knowing and more relevant than the other kind. She sat in the kitchen and accepted tea that was better than parlor tea, and began with the sheepfold question, and concluded it in about 8 minutes. Then she looked at Clara. "He hasn't written back," she said. Clara understood immediately who and what. "No. Nor is he going to." "I don't think so." "Does that concern you?" Margaret asked, not unkindly in the way of someone establishing facts. "It concerns me," Clara said, "only in the sense that I've been watching Oswald Pemberton tell the county a story that isn't true, and there's no obvious moment where it becomes false in a way anyone can point to." She paused. "Not until something happens, or doesn't happen." "Something will happen," Margaret said. "How do you know?" "Because," Margaret said, "your father doesn't not reply by accident. He's the most intentional correspondent I've known in 60 years. When he doesn't write back to something, it's because he's waiting for something else." She took her tea. "I've known Henry Thornton for 35 years. He proposed to your mother in person, in that kitchen, because he said a letter was insufficient for the occasion." Clara looked at her. "He proposed in this kitchen?" "Came in through the back door, which was the only door that was unlocked, and waited for her in here for an hour until she came back from the south field." Margaret set down her cup. "He told me afterward it was not the right question to put in writing." A small silence. "He hasn't told me any of this," Clara said. "No, he wouldn't." Margaret looked out the window at the January fields. "He's not the kind of man who explains the rules before the game. He just expects the right player to understand them. And if the right player doesn't know the rules, then he's the wrong player," Margaret said simply. "But your father is not, I think, worried about that." Clara sat with this for a moment. "What about Oswald Pemberton?" "Oswald Pemberton," Margaret said, "has had his son turned down by 3 families this autumn. He needs someone suitable to be unavailable." She rose and gathered her coat. "Don't let him make your situation into his solution." She left by the same road she had come, which was still cold and still passable. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her go, and thought about a man who had come through the back door in January and waited an hour in the kitchen because the question was not suitable for a letter. What does it mean to be descended from people who understood certain things? And does that understanding arrive by blood or by watching? January settled in, and with it, the particular quiet of a winter that has no intention of being anything other than what it is. The Thornton farm contracted to its winter form. The livestock required attention. The stored feed required monitoring. The accounts required completion before the end of the year, which they had been, and the beginning of the new year, which they would be. Clara worked through this with her usual systematic thoroughness and found it, as she always found winter work, more satisfying than summer work. Cleaner lines, clearer results, the pleasure of things made ready. Her father was the same, through December and into January. He went about his work, he read in the evenings, he spoke when there was something to say and not when there wasn't. They had dinner together every evening, had done so as long as Clara could remember, first with her mother and then just the two of them. And the dinners were the same as they had always been. Good food, sensible conversation, no performance. It was after dinner one evening in the middle of January that he said what he said. The fire had settled into its late evening form, the kind that gives warmth rather than light, and he was reading, and she was in her ledger, and the room had that particular quality of companionable silence that two people can only achieve after long practice. Outside, the snow had been falling since afternoon. "Your mother," he said without any particular preamble. Clara looked up. "I knew," he said, still looking at his book, "quite early on that she was right. The difficulty was how to be certain she knew I was certain." He turned a page. "She was the kind of person who didn't require demonstrations," he continued. "She would have said she didn't want them, but she paid attention to what people did rather than what they said." A pause. "She never once told me what she needed. She trusted me to work it out. And did you?" "Eventually," he said. It took longer than it should have, and then I came through the back door in January and she was not as surprised as she should have been, which told me she had understood it all along. Clara looked at the fire. She knew what you were going to do? I believe, he said, that she understood what kind of man I was, which amounted to knowing the same thing. He turned another page. She was a good judge of character. He read, and she wrote, and neither of them said anything further about it. And the fire burned down in the usual way, and at the usual hour they said good night and went to their separate rooms. But the thing had been said. Clara lay awake for a while after, and thought about what her father said when he talked about her mother, and what he meant when he said the things he said, and whether the two were always the same thing or only sometimes. What does a parent reveal when they speak about the person they loved? And does the child who listens always understand what's being said? The letter remained on the desk in the study. This was not unusual, precisely, in the sense that Henry Thornton kept papers he was attending to on the desk and filed papers he had finished with. And this paper was clearly still being attended to in some sense, even if the nature of that attendance looked, from the outside, like doing nothing. Clara passed the study door every morning. Every morning the letter was there. She did not read it. She did not pick it up. She was fully aware that it was there. Her supplementary ledger had, since September, one entry that concerned the Duke. She had written it on a Thursday evening in September, after the Pemberton gathering, in her careful, precise hand, and it said what she had observed and concluded on that day, and it ended with, he was correct. She had not added to it. In the second week of January, after the evening with her father and the fire and the story about the back door and the backfield, she opened the ledger to the September entry and read it. It was exactly what she remembered it being. Factual, specific, complete for what it was. She read it several times, not because it was ambiguous, but because she was thinking about something that was not quite on the page. Then she turned to a fresh page, which was the first fresh page she had turned since September, and she wrote one sentence. The West Culvert will need attention before March, or the spring melt will make it worse. She read this sentence, considered it. It was true. It was also a sentence she could have written at any point since September, because she had known it since September. And the only reason she had not written it was that it hadn't seemed necessary until now. She closed the ledger. She could not have explained precisely why she had written it now. It wasn't as though writing it in the ledger changed anything about the culvert, which would require attention whether or not she had noted it. It wasn't as though the sentence was new information. It was a piece of practical knowledge set down at the proper time in the book where such things went. The letter was still on her father's desk. The ledger was closed on her own desk. Outside, the January cold continued its steady occupation of the landscape, indifferent to what was or wasn't being decided inside any particular house. The snow from the evening before had crusted over in the frost. Clara went to bed. She was aware, without examining it too closely, that she was waiting for something. She was also aware, from long practice, from watching her father, from knowing herself, that the things worth waiting for do not announce themselves in advance. What does it mean to keep a careful record of things? And what does it mean to know that no record, however careful, is ever the whole of it? Sir Oswald Pemberton visited Henry Thornton in the last week of January. He came, as he always came, with a visible reason that was not the real reason. The visible reason was a question about the shared boundary fence near the north pasture, which was a legitimate question in the sense that the fence existed and had accumulated minor damage over the winter, and which was the kind of question that could equally well have been sent in a note, but which Sir Oswald apparently needed to discuss in person. He was good at finding these questions. He had been finding them for 20 years. Henry listened to the fence question and gave his view on it, which was that the repair could wait until March, when the ground would accept posts properly, and that the cost should be shared equally as the original agreement stipulated. Sir Oswald agreed and did not leave. Henry, he said, and this was the moment when his tone shifted to the particular register that meant he had arrived at his actual purpose. I want to say something, as a neighbor, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's meant. Say it, Henry said. This business with Wexford. Sir Oswald arranged his expression into something sympathetic. It's been some months now. People talk. I've tried to set the record straight, told them the decision was yours to make as you see fit. Entirely proper. But I want you to know that there are those who are suggesting it would be tidier for everyone if the matter were formally concluded. If there were some indication, the matter, Henry said, is not concluded. Sir Oswald paused. I see, he recalibrated. Well, that is, of course, I only meant that if there were something I might communicate on your behalf to, there is nothing you need to communicate on my behalf. 3 words short of 3 sentences. Sir Oswald understood he had reached a wall. Of course, he said. He left shortly after. Henry went back to what he had been doing, which was the January accounts. He did not tell Claire about the visit. She found out from Anne Fenton a week later. Sir Oswald had apparently been mentioning, in various company, that he had had a very illuminating private conversation with Henry Thornton, from which he had come away with the clear impression that the family's position was settled. He did not use the word refused. He used settled, which is a different word but which produces a similar impression when received by people who have been primed for it. Clara told her father what she had heard. He listened without changing expression. He's not lying exactly, Clara said. He's just using what's true to imply something that isn't. Yes, Henry said. It will reach the Duke. Probably. Does that concern you? Henry looked at the January accounts. Not particularly, he said. Clara looked at him for a moment. He was doing arithmetic. She went back to what she had been doing. Is it possible to tell a truth in a way that amounts to a lie? And who bears responsibility for what the listener understands? In the first week of February, in Yorkshire, the Duke of Wexford was in his library at 8 in the morning reading the county drainage records. He had been reading them, in one form or another, since October. This had not escaped the notice of his steward, Barnaby Cromwell, who had been with the estate for 30 years and had developed a thorough familiarity with what it meant when His Grace read county records extensively without there being any obvious estate project to account for it. You've been through the entire West Riding drainage survey, Your Grace, Barnaby said one morning. They have gaps. They do. The 1748 edition wasn't fully updated for the new culvert work in the Thornwick section. The Duke looked at the maps spread on the table before him. The Thornwick section was, in fact, precisely the area in which he had been spending a disproportionate amount of cartographic attention for the past 3 months. Order the updated materials from York, he said. Yes, Your Grace. The Thornwick section in particular? The full section, and anything they have on the boundary drainage for the east-facing fields in the Thornton area. Of course. Barnaby went to order the materials. He did not remark on anything. The situation, which he understood in the way that good stewards understand the situations of the people they work for, was this. A man had written a letter in November. The letter had received no reply. In December, the general understanding of the county had begun to solidify, through a process the Duke had been able to observe from a distance, around the interpretation that the silence constituted a refusal. The Duke was not certain that this was the correct interpretation. He was also not certain how to determine whether it was correct without doing something that would be awkward if it turned out to be correct. He had therefore been reading drainage records. This was, he was aware, not a particularly rational strategy. But it was a strategy that involved thinking about the same county and the same land and the same particular configuration of soil and water that had been the subject of the only conversation he had had in years where he felt, while having it, that he had not used his mind as well as it was capable of being used. He had not gone to any county social events since September. He told himself this was because he was occupied with estate business, which was true. He told himself it was not because the possibility of being in a room with Clara Thornton while being uncertain of the situation was unappealing in a way he could not straightforwardly address, which was also true, and somewhat less comfortable to acknowledge. In the first week of February, he received a note from an acquaintance, a well-meaning man named Stanhope, who moved in the same county circles, that mentioned briefly and in passing that Sir Oswald Pemberton had been circulating a particular account of the Thornton family's position, and that from all indications the matter was, in Pemberton's words, entirely settled. He read this note twice. Then he did something that he had been avoiding since November, not because he had been afraid of it, but because he had been waiting to understand it better, and he had now concluded that understanding it better was not going to happen from a distance. He called for his horse. What does it look like when a man has made a decision and then discovers that the decision has already made him? And is there a word for arriving at a place you were already going? The road to Thornwick in February is not a pleasant road. This is a statement that applies to most North Riding roads in February, which commit fully to the experience of cold without providing any of the scenic compensation that sometimes makes winter landscapes worth the inconvenience. The Duke rode rather than taking the carriage, partly because the carriage was slower, and partly because he had decided, at some point on the road, that arriving in a carriage announced itself differently than arriving on horseback, and he did not want to announce himself. He wanted to arrive. The distinction felt important. He reached Thornton Farm in the early afternoon. It was a modest property, well maintained in the specific way that means work rather than money. Fields that showed evidence of being properly managed, boundaries that were exactly where they should be. Nothing superfluous and nothing missing. He had seen it on the county maps. It was different in person, as things always were. He knocked at the front door. Henry Thornton opened it. They had met twice before, at county gatherings, briefly enough that the Duke had formed a general impression. A man of 60, weathered, with hands that had done actual work and eyes that were conducting some ongoing assessment of the world. The general impression was consistent with what stood in the door now. "Your Grace," Henry Thornton said. "Mr. Thornton." He paused because something was required here. "I should have written first." Henry Thornton looked at him steadily. "You have written," he said. "Come in." He turned and went inside, and the Duke followed him, and he found himself in a kitchen rather than a parlor, a warm, practical kitchen with the evidence of actual daily use on every surface, which was, he realized, exactly the right room for what was happening. Henry Thornton indicated a chair. The Duke sat. Henry sat opposite him and folded his hands on the table and waited. "I received a letter," the Duke said, "or rather a note, suggesting that the matter was settled, that there was a clear position." "From Pemberton," Henry said, "not a question." "From someone who had spoken to Pemberton." Henry said nothing for a moment. "The matter," he said, "is not settled." "I gathered that might be the case," the Duke said, "when I found I was unable to proceed on that basis." "Unable to proceed how?" "To treat it as concluded." He looked at his hands. "I tried for approximately 10 weeks. I was not successful." Henry Thornton looked at him with the expression of someone doing a thorough and unhurried assessment. "Why did you come in person?" he said. "Because a letter," the Duke said, "was not sufficient for the occasion." Henry Thornton was quiet for what seemed like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. "Clara," he called, not loudly, as one might call someone who is nearby. The door to the study opened. Clara Thornton came through it. She had ink on her right hand, which meant she had been writing when he called, and she looked from her father to the Duke with an expression that was composed and direct, and not, as far as the Duke could tell, surprised. "Yes, father?" "His Grace has come about the West Culvert," Henry said, "among other things." She looked at the Duke. He looked at her. "Among other things," he confirmed. "I'll get the tea," Henry Thornton said. He rose and moved to the fire, and the Duke and his daughter looked at each other across the kitchen table in the particular way of two people who have been thinking about the same conversation for several months and are now having it. "You are not surprised," the Duke said, "to see me." "My father said," Clara said, "that a letter was not sufficient for certain occasions." She paused. "He said it this way, that it was not the right question to put in writing." The Duke looked at Henry Thornton's back. "He said this," he said. "When?" "Some years ago, about a different occasion." The kettle made its sound. Henry Thornton, without turning, said, "The culvert will need the south channel cleared before March." "Yes," the Duke said. "I was planning to address it in the spring." "Before March," Henry repeated, "or the spring melt makes it worse." "Before March," the Duke agreed. Henry set out 3 cups. What does it cost a man to do the right thing when he has not been told what the right thing is? And does the cost change when he discovers there was a test? The formal proposal came the following week. This was the Duke's doing, not prompted. He came back to Thornton Farm on a Tuesday, properly, in the morning, and had the kind of conversation with Henry Thornton that such occasions require. Henry listened to it in its entirety. He asked 3 questions. The answers satisfied him, which they would not have done in November or December or January or before the first week of February. "Yes," he said. That was the whole of it. The wedding was in April at Thornwick Church, with the people who mattered and not too many who didn't. The morning was cool and bright, which passes in North Riding for good weather. Margaret Dunmore attended and said very little, which was her version of a great deal. Anne Fenton attended and cried, which was Anne's version of the same thing. Sir Oswald Pemberton attended because one attends these things, and he offered his congratulations with exactly the graciousness the situation required, and they were received by Clara with exactly the warmth they deserved. The morning after the February visit, the day after the Duke had been shown to the guest room and matters had taken the shape they were going to take, Henry had come to Clara in the kitchen with the expression of a man who has something to say and has decided to say it. "I want to explain," he said. "You don't need to. I know that." He sat down at the table. "I wrote 3 letters in November. I didn't send any of them. A letter tells you what a man thinks. A visit tells you what a man does. I needed to know which kind of man this was." Clara looked at him. "You could have told me." "If I had told you," he said, "it would have been my test. He would have been passing it for your sake, not because the thing itself required it of him." He looked at the table. "It had to be his. He had to want to come." "Did you know he would?" Henry Thornton was quiet for a moment that Clara recognized as genuine consideration rather than the rhetorical kind. "No," he said. "I hoped." It was the most her father had said about uncertainty in her living memory. She held this with care. On a morning in April, a week before the wedding, the Duke found her in the study with the supplementary ledger. She showed him the September entry without being asked, simply opened it and offered it across the desk. He read it. The careful record of their conversation, the 90 minutes, his error found and acknowledged, ending with, "He was correct." He read it again. "You wrote this the same evening," he said. "Yes." He turned the page and found the January entry, the single sentence about the West Culvert and the spring melt. "Just this?" "Just that." He read it. He sat with it for a moment. "We addressed the culvert in March," Clara said. "I know." He handed the ledger back. "Before spring." "Before spring." He looked at her for a while. "There should have been more entries," he said. "Yes," she said, "there will be." She closed the ledger. Henry Thornton filed the November letter in his desk, in the drawer where he kept things he had resolved. He attended his daughter's wedding in his best coat and said almost nothing all day, which everyone who knew him understood as a particular form of happiness. The supplementary ledger continued. Its entries after April were more numerous than those before it, and ranged across the usual subjects: drainage, soil, seasonal patterns, yield projections, the occasional question not yet answered, and were consulted with some regularity by both people who lived in the house, one of whom had read the county records more thoroughly than anyone in the riding, and one of whom kept the most useful set of agricultural observations in the north of England. The West Culvert was addressed before every subsequent march, without exception. What does it mean to wait for something to become itself, rather than pushing it into a shape? And does the waiting require the same courage as the acting, or a different kind?